John had always found peace in solitude, a tranquility that seemed to settle deep into his bones every time he stepped outside his small wooden cabin nestled at the edge of the forest. For years, he had lived in harmony with nature, finding comfort in the quiet rustling of leaves, the song of the wind through the trees, and the steady rhythm of the seasons. The cabin, a modest structure built with his own hands, stood as a quiet sentinel in the midst of towering pines and the untamed beauty of the forest. It was the perfect refuge for someone who sought the quiet simplicity of life and wanted nothing more than to be surrounded by the world's natural wonders. Whiskers, his faithful companion, was always at his side. The sleek black cat was as much a part of the forest as the trees themselves. Whiskers was more than just a pet, he was John's friend and confidant. Always by his side on his daily walks through the woods. A watchful and intelligent presence. Whiskers had a way of sensing things, an uncanny ability to find what others might miss. John often wondered if the cat understood the forest better than he did. They had formed a bond over the years. One that spoke volumes without the need for words. Whiskers was his constant companion. As content in the wilderness as John was. One crisp autumn morning, John decided to take Whiskers on a longer walk than usual. The forest was alive with the vibrant colors of fall. The leaves turning shades of orange, red, and gold. The air was cool, and the earth smelled rich with the scent of damp soil and pine needles. Whiskers padded along beside him, darting here and there, his sleek black coat contrasting sharply with the golden hues of the forest floor. John smiled to himself, feeling grateful for this simple life, for the peacefulness that came from being surrounded by nature, away from the bustle of the world. The forest was unusually quiet that morning. The typical sounds of birds and squirrels seemed muted, as though even the animals were taking a deep breath. John noted it but thought little of it. Whiskers, however, was more alert than usual, his ears twitching at every sound, his sharp eyes scanning the underbrush. John had long since learned to trust Whiskers' instincts, so he followed the cat's lead as they walked deeper into the forest. It wasn't long before Whiskers stopped in his tracks, ears pricked forward, his body tense. John followed the cat's gaze and saw what had caught his attention. Under a large oak tree, partially hidden by the underbrush, lay a small bear cub. Its dark fur was matted with dirt and blood, and it was lying motionless on the ground. John's heart dropped into his stomach as he hurried forward, instinctively reaching out to check the cub's condition. The little bear was breathing, but it was weak, its tiny body trembling from the cold. It was clear that it had been injured, its left leg twisted in an unnatural way. John knelt down beside it, his hands gentle but firm as he assessed the bear's injuries. There was no sign of the cub's mother, and John's heart sank even further. The bear was alone, injured, and vulnerable. He knew that the chances of the cub surviving without help were slim. The thought of leaving it to fend for itself was unbearable. "Whiskers, we have to help," John murmured, his voice thick with emotion. The cat, as if understanding, sat quietly beside him, watching with an almost knowing gaze. John took a deep breath, trying to steady his hands. He wasn't a wildlife expert, but he had lived in the woods long enough to know how to handle situations like this. He had helped injured animals before, whether it was a bird with a broken wing or a deer caught in a trap. This was different, though. This was a bear, and bears were wild, unpredictable creatures. but John's compassion for the creature in front of him overrode any fear or hesitation. He carefully lifted the cub, cradling it gently in his arms, and turned back toward his cabin. Whiskers fell into step beside him, as if leading the way, his tail swishing calmly behind him. It wasn't long before they arrived back at the cabin, and John set the cub down in a makeshift bed near the hearth. John worked quickly, gathering supplies to treat the cub's injuries. He cleaned the wound on its leg as best as he could, using the knowledge he had acquired over the years from his time spent living in the wild. It wasn't perfect, but it was all he could do. He wrapped the injured leg with a bandage and placed a warm cloth over the cub's body to help it regain its strength. He knew the bear needed warmth and food, but more than anything, it needed time to heal. For the next several days, John tended to the cub's every need. Whiskers, ever watchful, stayed close by, curling up beside the cub in the evenings, offering quiet companionship. John couldn't help but notice the bond forming between the cat and the bear. Whiskers would sit patiently while the cub rested, occasionally batting playfully at the cub's ears when it stirred. The sight of the two of them together, Whiskers, sleek and nimble, and the bear, large and lumbering, was a strange and beautiful one. It was a reminder that nature, in all its forms, was connected in ways that went beyond what humans could understand. As the days passed, the cub grew stronger, its once shaky movements became steadier, and it began to show interest in food. John had started feeding it small amounts of honey, berries, and the occasional fish he caught from the nearby stream. Slowly but surely, the cub regained its strength, its playful nature returning. It was a joy to see it move with more confidence, to hear the soft sounds of its growls and playful huffs as it explored the small cabin. John knew that the cub couldn't stay with him forever. It was a wild animal, and the forest was where it belonged. But for now, John was content to care for the bear, giving it a chance at life that it otherwise might not have had. It was a reminder of the fragility of life in the wild, and how quickly things could change. One morning, after several weeks of nursing the cub back to health, John took it outside to the edge of the forest. Whiskers followed closely behind, watching with an almost knowing gaze. The cub, now stronger and more agile, took a tentative step into the woods, its eyes scanning the trees as if sensing the world that lay beyond. With a heavy heart but a sense of fulfillment, John stood back, allowing the cub to find its way. Whiskers, as always, stayed by his side. The bear cub paused for a moment, looked back at them, and then disappeared into the trees, its small figure swallowed by the vastness of the forest. John watched it go, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He had given the cub a chance to live, and now it was time for it to take its place in the wild once more. Whiskers nudged John's hand, and he smiled softly, knowing that, in his own way, the cat had been part of this journey too. Together, they had helped the bear, and together, they would continue to walk the forest, their quiet lives intertwined with the wilderness they loved. It was a brisk autumn afternoon when Whiskers, John's ever-watchful black cat, led him deep into the forest. John had come to trust Whiskers' instincts over the years, and today was no different. The cat, moving with his usual silent grace, darted through the underbrush, his sleek body a flash of shadow against the golden backdrop of the forest. John followed closely, his boots crunching on the leaves, his heart light, but a faint sense of unease tugging at him. Whiskers never acted like this unless something was amiss. As they ventured farther into the woods, the air seemed to grow heavier, charged with the silent tension of nature. The usual chirps of birds and rustling of small animals were absent. And John noticed how still the forest had become. It was then that he saw it, a small bear cub, lying motionless beneath a large fallen log. The cub was barely visible, its fur matted with dirt and wet from what seemed like a recent rainstorm. Its breathing was shallow, and its small frame shuddered with each labored breath. John knelt beside the cub immediately, heart sinking. Whiskers was already beside him, pacing in tight circles, his tail twitching in distress. John reached down and carefully examined the little bear, his fingers tracing the torn edges of the cub's fur. It was clear that the cub had been caught in the aftermath of a violent storm. A heavy thunderstorm had passed through the area just the day before, leaving behind a trail of destruction, broken branches, scattered debris, and now, a wounded animal in need of help. The storm had likely knocked the cub from a tree, and with injuries like these, it was unlikely Leo, as John would soon name him, could survive on his own. Poor little one, John muttered, gently lifting the cub into his arms. Whiskers, ever the companion, silently walked beside them, his steady pace matching John's as they began their walk back toward the cabin. John could feel the weight of the cub's fragile body in his arms, and a deep sense of responsibility filled his chest. He had seen the ways of the forest, how nature took care of itself, how the strong survived and the weak often didn't. But this wasn't the wild. This was a creature in need. And John couldn't leave it to chance. The journey back to the cabin felt longer than usual. The once vibrant forest had grown quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath. John's mind raced as he carefully cradled the injured cub, wondering how he could help. His small cabin, though simple, had everything he needed, basic supplies, a warmth that came from the hearth, and the love for nature that guided everything he did. Once inside, John laid Leo down in the corner of the cabin near the fireplace. He carefully removed the wet leaves and dirt from the cub's fur, his heart aching at the sight of the injuries. The storm had left its mark, scrapes and bruises, some deep, others superficial, and a twisted paw that seemed to be the most concerning injury. It was a miracle Leo had survived the storm at all. Whiskers, ever the vigilant observer, sat nearby, his green eyes watching closely. There was something in the way the cat looked at the cub that made John smile softly. It was as if Whiskers knew exactly what was at stake here. Together, they had found Leo, and now they would do everything they could to help him heal. John worked quickly but carefully. He set up a makeshift bed with soft blankets, adding a bit of straw for warmth. He then took stock of the things he had: clean bandages, antiseptic, and some natural healing ointments he had gathered over the years. With steady hands, he began cleaning the cub's wounds, taking care not to cause further pain. It was a slow process, but as the evening wore on, Leo's condition seemed to stabilize, though the cub still lay limply, exhausted from the ordeal. Over the following days, John's life revolved around Leo's care. Every morning, he would check on the cub, cleaning its injuries and making sure it was warm. Whiskers remained a constant presence, his sharp eyes watching over the cub with a quiet intensity. The cat would often curl up beside Leo, offering companionship in a way only animals could. John would laugh softly at the sight, marveling at the bond that was already beginning to form between the two. It was as if Whiskers understood the importance of this fragile creature. And in his own way, he protected Leo as much as John did. At night, John would sit by the fire, reading aloud in soft tones to the cub, hoping the sound of his voice would offer some comfort. Whiskers, ever faithful, would be by his side, occasionally stretching out beside Leo, offering the warmth of his body. John spoke to the cub as if it could understand, telling it stories of the forest, of the seasons, and the animals that lived there. Though the cub's eyes remained closed most of the time, John couldn't help but feel that there was some connection between them, a silent understanding that the cub was listening. After about a week, Leo's condition began to improve. His breathing steadied, and the swelling in his paw slowly began to subside. Though he was still weak, he began to move a little more, stretching his limbs and twitching his ears. It was a relief to see the cub start to show signs of recovery. John's heart lifted as he noticed Leo's gaze becoming more alert, his small eyes tracking movements and sounds around the cabin. Whiskers, sensing that the cub was getting stronger, began to playfully bat at Leo's paw whenever he was awake, as if to coax him into moving. The little bear would try to swipe back, though his efforts were clumsy at first. But slowly, the playful exchanges became more frequent, and John watched with joy as Leo began to regain his strength. By the third week, Leo was moving more confidently, though he still limped slightly from the injury. John took him outside for short walks around the cabin, watching closely as the cub explored the forest with growing curiosity. Whiskers, ever the guide, would accompany them, walking just ahead and keeping an eye on Leo, as if ensuring the cub understood the ways of the wild. It was a bittersweet feeling for John. He knew that eventually, Leo would need to return to the wild where he truly belonged. It was hard to imagine sending him back out into the vastness of the forest, knowing how vulnerable he still was. But John had always understood the ways of the wild. The forest was where Leo belonged. And though John had given him a second chance at life, it was up to the cub to reclaim his place in the world. As the weeks passed, Leo grew stronger, his playful spirit returning in full force. One morning, after a long walk through the forest, Leo stopped and looked back at John, his eyes reflecting a quiet understanding. It was time. With a final glance at John, and a nudge from Whiskers, Leo turned toward the trees and disappeared into the forest, his silhouette blending into the shadows. John stood there for a long time, watching the cub vanish into the wilderness, knowing that he had done all he could. Whiskers sat at his feet, looking up at him as if to say, "It's done." John smiled softly, his heart filled with pride and love. Leo was free now, a wild creature once more, and the forest would be his home. After weeks of careful nursing and attention, Leo, the bear cub John had rescued, was finally strong enough to return to the wild. John had watched as the small creature's strength returned, the limp in his paw gradually fading, and his playful nature emerging once more. With a bittersweet heart, John knew it was time for Leo to reclaim his place in the forest, where he truly belonged. Yet, as the days passed and Leo was released back into the wild, it wasn't the end of their connection, it was simply a new chapter in a unique friendship. The morning of Leo's departure was a quiet one. The forest was alive with the sounds of the wind moving through the trees, the distant chatter of birds, and the rustling of leaves underfoot. John stood by the edge of the woods, Whiskers by his side, watching as the bear cub took his first steps back into the forest. There was a moment of hesitation, a pause, as if Leo was looking back to make sure everything was all right. Then, with a soft grunt, he turned and disappeared into the woods. The weight of the moment settled over John. But he knew it was right. The wild was where Leo belonged. But nature, it seemed, had its own plans. As the days went on, John began to notice something unusual. Every now and then, he would catch a glimpse of movement at the edge of the trees, or hear the soft sound of footsteps outside his cabin. At first, he thought it was a trick of his mind, perhaps his imagination playing tricks on him after the emotional experience of releasing Leo. But as the visits became more frequent, it became clear Leo was back. The first time John saw the bear cub again, it was just before dawn. He was sipping his morning coffee, watching the mist roll off the forest floor when he noticed a large shadow move in the trees. He stood up, surprised, and peered through the window. There, at the edge of the garden, stood Leo, his dark fur blending with the early morning shadows. He was no longer the small, fragile cub John had first found. He had grown, tall, strong, and more confident, but there was no mistaking the familiar gaze in his eyes. Whiskers, ever the watchful cat, padded over to John's side, his tail twitching in curiosity. When John opened the door, Leo turned his head and gave a soft grunt, as if acknowledging the man's presence. Whiskers, with his usual quiet grace, stepped out onto the porch, his sleek black coat a stark contrast against the green backdrop of the yard. For a moment, John watched, his heart warmed by the sight of the two animals, Leo, now wild and free, and Whiskers, steadfast and protective, meeting in the open air of John's small garden. It didn't take long for a silent understanding to pass between the two creatures. Whiskers, curious but not afraid, approached Leo slowly, his tail swaying gently behind him. Leo, with the cautious nature of a young bear, stood still for a moment, watching the cat with his keen eyes. Then, in a gesture that seemed almost deliberate, Leo lowered his head and nudged Whiskers gently with his snout. Whiskers, after a brief pause, responded in kind, rubbing his head against Leo's fur in a show of feline affection. From that day forward, the bond between the two animals grew. They became fast friends, spending hours together in the garden, playing in the yard, and wandering through the trees as if they were an inseparable pair. Whiskers, who had once been content to explore the woods alone with John, now had a companion who shared his sense of adventure. Together, they ran through the tall grass, battered at leaves, and explored the streams that ran through John's land. It was a beautiful sight, a small, sleek black cat and a powerful young bear, side by side, forming an unlikely but deeply affectionate duo. For John, this strange and wonderful friendship brought a sense of peace he hadn't realized he needed. The world outside his cabin had always felt distant, a place of wildness and challenge. But within the walls of his home, he had created a sanctuary, a safe space for both himself and the creatures who needed it. And now, that sanctuary had grown even more special. The presence of Leo and Whiskers, together, brought a joy that John couldn't put into words. The sound of their play, the soft rumble of Leo's growls mixed with Whiskers' chirps and purrs, filled the cabin with warmth. It was a quiet happiness, one that flowed through the simple days spent together in nature. Despite the wildness of the forest, despite the challenges it presented, there was something comforting in knowing that the animals of this world, those that John had saved, and those that he lived alongside, understood the importance of connection. Leo, though now a wild animal, still returned to visit John regularly. He would come in the mornings, sometimes in the afternoons, even on stormy nights when the wind howled and the rain poured down. Each time, he would stand at the edge of the garden, and John, Whiskers by his side, would welcome him with a warm smile. The bond between them all, man, cat, and bear, was something that transcended the boundaries of the wild and the domestic. As the months passed, Leo grew stronger. His once limping gait turned into confident strides as he traversed the land. But no matter how much time passed, no matter how much he changed, the connection he shared with John and Whiskers remained as strong as ever. The forest was now Leo's home, but he had not forgotten the kindness he had received when he was in need. It was as if he knew that the love and care John had given him would always be there, that the door to his home would always be open when he needed it. One chilly winter evening, when the first snow had begun to fall and the forest was wrapped in a blanket of white, Leo arrived once again. He was no longer a small cub, but a young bear with the stature of his wild ancestors. Yet, when he stepped into the garden, his eyes softened as he saw Whiskers sitting by the fire and John standing on the porch. With a low rumble of recognition, he ambled over to them, and Whiskers greeted him with a gentle meow, rubbing his face against Leo's powerful leg. It was a simple, silent exchange, but it carried the weight of the deep friendship they had forged over the months. John stood watching, his heart full. In the wild, it was rare for animals to form bonds like this, to share moments of affection with creatures of different kinds. But here, in his little corner of the world, it had happened, and it was a beautiful thing. A reminder that, despite the wildness and the challenge of nature, there was always space for kindness, connection, and unexpected friendships. In the years that followed, John continued to live in his cabin, surrounded by the wildness he had always loved, but with a deeper sense of peace. Leo and Whiskers became his family, and together they shared in the quiet joy of the natural world. John knew that the bond between him, Whiskers, and Leo was a rare and precious gift, one that reminded him of the deep connections that could exist between all living beings, regardless of their form or nature. And in the company of his two friends, John found a happiness that was simple, profound, and everlasting. Years had passed since Leo, the bear John had once nursed back to health, had wandered back into the wild. In those years, John's life had remained largely unchanged. His days were still filled with the simple, quiet routine of living in his cabin at the edge of the forest, tending to his garden, and enjoying the companionship of Whiskers, his faithful black cat. Though Leo's visits had become less frequent as the bear grew older and more independent, John always kept a place in his heart for the young cub he had once cared for. But that day, as John was tending to his garden, something felt different. The air was still, and the forest around him seemed quieter than usual. He bent down to prune a rose bush, his hands steady as he worked, when he heard the unmistakable sound of rustling at the edge of the yard. Startled, he looked up, his heart momentarily skipping a beat. There, standing at the edge of the garden, was a large bear. It wasn't just any bear. It was Leo, but much larger now, his once small frame having grown into a powerful, majestic creature. His dark fur was thick and well maintained. His movements sure and strong. The bear's eyes, however, still carried the same familiar warmth and recognition that John had seen in the cub so many years ago. John's heart swelled with a mixture of joy and nostalgia as he slowly rose to his feet. "Leo," John whispered, a smile tugging at his lips. But what surprised John even more wasn't just Leo's return, it was what Leo was bringing with him. From behind the larger bear, two smaller figures emerged, cautiously stepping forward. At first, John thought they might be other animals. But as they drew closer, he realized they were cubs, two bear cubs, with coats of soft, cinnamon brown and eyes full of wonder. They were small, but their movements were already confident, like they had inherited their father's strength and curiosity. John's smile widened as he took in the sight of the cubs. He recognized the deep, gentle gaze of Leo, but these were not just any cubs, they were Leo's children. John could feel the warmth in his heart as he realized that the bond between him, Leo, and these new bears was stronger than ever. Are these your cubs, Leo?" John asked, his voice filled with a quiet awe. Leo let out a soft, rumbling sound, almost like a purr, and nudged the two cubs forward. Milo, the smaller of the two, took a few tentative steps toward John, his eyes wide and curious. Bella, the slightly larger cub, stuck close to her brother, but her gaze was equally filled with wonder as she observed John. The two cubs were so much like their father in their movements, their playfulness, and the way they carried themselves with an innocent, yet growing sense of confidence. Whiskers, who had been lounging in a sunbeam by the door, stretched lazily and padded over to see what all the commotion was about. He stopped at the edge of the porch, his tail flicking in cautious curiosity. At first, he hesitated, unsure of these new visitors. But as Leo gave a soft grunt of recognition, Whiskers seemed to relax. He padded forward, cautiously sniffing the air, then gave a low, almost approving meow. The little cubs looked at Whiskers with wide, innocent eyes. But after a moment's hesitation, they seemed to accept him. And Milo even gave a tentative swipe at Whiskers' tail, causing the cat to jump back with a playful flick of his own. John chuckled softly, the scene before him feeling like a dream. Leo, the bear he had saved so many years ago, had come back, not only to visit but to introduce his own family, the next generation that would carry on the wild spirit of the forest. The moment was deeply moving. John knew that he had played a role in helping Leo survive. And now, seeing Leo as a father, bringing his cubs to visit the man who had once saved him, filled John with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The visit wasn't just a return, it was a testament to the bond that had formed between them all. John had cared for Leo when he was weak and vulnerable. And now, Leo was strong, free, and living in the wild, just as he was meant to. But despite the years and the distance that had grown between them, Leo had returned, bringing his family to show his gratitude. It was an unspoken acknowledgement of the circle of life, of the delicate balance between man and nature. "Come here, you two," John said softly, kneeling down on one knee as the cubs approached. He reached out his hand, and Milo, more curious than cautious, stepped closer, his small nose sniffing at John's fingers. Bella followed, a bit more reserved, but clearly intrigued. John smiled as they inspected him, feeling the familiar connection he had once shared with their father. These cubs, though young and wild, seemed to have a sense of understanding in their eyes. They, too, had inherited the deep, quiet wisdom of the forest, and they were beginning to learn the ways of the world. For a few moments, John sat in silence, his heart swelling with emotion as he watched the family interact. Whiskers, having apparently accepted the cubs, now lay down in the sun, watching the young bears with mild amusement. It was as if the three of them, Leo, Whiskers, and John, had all come to an unspoken understanding. Though their lives were so different, one wild, one domestic, and one somewhere in between, there was a quiet bond that held them together. They shared the forest, the land, and the unspoken respect that comes with living in harmony with the world around them. Leo, who had been quietly observing the interaction, gave a low grunt, almost as if signaling that it was time to go. He nudged Milo and Bella gently with his snout, and the two cubs, now comfortable in their surroundings, turned and headed back toward the woods, their steps light and playful. Leo lingered for a moment, giving John a final glance. The bear's eyes were full of gratitude and something deeper, something that spoke of a bond forged in kindness, survival, and mutual respect. As the bear family disappeared into the trees, John stood, his heart full. He watched as Leo, with his cubs in tow, faded into the forest. It was a moment of bittersweet joy. The forest was where they all belonged, but the love and connection they had shared, once again, was something that would stay with him forever. Whiskers hopped onto the porch, sitting beside John and gazing out into the woods. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They had witnessed something beautiful together, something rare, something that would stay with them both for the rest of their lives. John knew that the circle of life was ever turning, and that while Leo would always be part of his past, the wild would continue to call to him, as it always had. And just as he had once cared for Leo, he knew that nature would always find a way to repay the kindness. As John turned back toward his cabin, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The wild had come full circle, and in its return, it had left him with a gift, an enduring bond that spanned generations and would never be forgotten. John stood on the porch, his heart swelling with a profound sense of wonder and gratitude as he watched Leo approach. The once weak cub he had nurtured back to health had transformed into a mighty, powerful bear, and now, with his two young cubs in tow, Leo was returning to the place where it all began. The sight was both humbling and joyous. Leo had come back not only as a wild creature but as a father, bringing his own family to honor the man who had given him a second chance at life. It was a moment that bridged the past with the present, a reminder of the powerful, unspoken bonds that exist between humans, animals, and the natural world. Whiskers, who had been lying lazily in the sun, sat up and watched as Leo approached with cautious steps. There was a quiet understanding in the air, a sense of peace that settled between the three of them. The cat, ever observant, gave a small, inquisitive meow, his tail flicking gently. He had watched Leo grow from a small cub into a mature bear. And now, he watched the next generation with his usual calm demeanor. The bond between John, Whiskers, and Leo had grown over the years. And now, it was expanding to include Leo's cubs, Milo and Bella. The cubs, playful and curious, bounded around the yard, their small paws sending bursts of dirt and leaves into the air as they tumbled over one another in a playful frenzy. Their innocence and energy filled the air with joy, their little growls and playful shrieks mingling with the rustling of the trees. John laughed softly, the sound rich with happiness, as he watched the cubs explore their surroundings. Whiskers, ever the cautious observer, kept a watchful eye on the young bears, his head turning every time they got too close. But there was no aggression, only a quiet acceptance of their presence. Then, Leo did something that moved John to the core. The large bear, standing tall and strong, lowered himself onto his knees in front of John, offering a silent gesture of respect and gratitude. His dark eyes, filled with an unmistakable warmth, locked onto John's. For a moment, there was no need for words. The gesture spoke volumes. Leo, who had once been a vulnerable, injured cub, had returned to show his appreciation. He was no longer the helpless creature that had been saved, but a proud father, standing in front of the man who had given him the chance to live. John felt his chest tighten with emotion as he watched the bear before him. In the years since he had rescued Leo, John had always wondered if the bear would remember him. And now, standing before him, Leo was showing him not just that he remembered, but that he held the kindness John had shown him all those years ago in the highest regard. The bond between them wasn't just about survival. It was about something deeper, something that went beyond the need for help and care. It was about mutual respect, love, and gratitude. John reached down, his hand brushing against Leo's massive head in a gentle caress. Leo's fur was thick and soft, and John could feel the strength in the animal's body, the power that lay beneath its graceful movements. And yet, despite this immense strength, Leo remained humble, as if acknowledging that the kindness he had received had shaped him into the bear he was today. Whiskers, ever the quiet presence, padded over to Leo and sat at his side, as if to offer his own form of acknowledgement. The cat's gaze was steady, his body relaxed, as though he too understood the significance of the moment. The three of them, a man, a cat, and a bear, stood in perfect harmony, surrounded by the forest that had witnessed their journey together. It was a sight that could only be understood by those who had lived alongside nature, who had felt the bond between all living creatures, no matter how different they might be. As the cubs continued to play in the garden, tumbling and wrestling with each other, John settled onto the porch steps. His heart full, Leo remained kneeling in front of him. And for a long moment, neither of them moved. It was as though the world had paused, just for a moment, to allow him to share in this quiet exchange of gratitude and understanding. John felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. This was a moment that spoke to the core of everything he had always believed, the connection between humans, animals, and the land was profound, timeless, and unbreakable. The simple act of caring for another creature, of offering kindness without expectation, had created a bond that would last a lifetime. Leo, after a while, rose to his feet and turned toward his cubs, who were now playfully rolling in the grass, their tiny growls filling the air. Milo and Bella had slowed their play and were now looking back at their father, waiting for a sign of what to do next. Leo gave a soft grunt, nudging the cubs toward John, who smiled warmly at them. John knew that, just as he had helped Leo all those years ago, he had now helped these cubs in a small but meaningful way. They had come to him, as Leo had, Not out of necessity but out of respect. They were learning, growing, and perhaps one day, they would return to the wild. Just as their father had done. The circle of life was continuing. And John was content in knowing that he had played a small part in it. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden, John, Leo, Whiskers, and the cubs sat together in the peaceful silence of the evening. The air was cool, and the faint sound of the forest, of leaves rustling and birds calling, filled the space around them. It was a perfect moment. One that reminded John of the simple, yet profound beauty of life. In that quiet, golden hour, John understood the message the universe had sent him through Leo's return. The act of kindness he had extended all those years ago had come full circle. It had created a bond, not only with Leo but with his cubs. And through them, the forest itself. Love and gratitude were not bound by species or time. They transcended the boundaries that often divided the world. A single act of help, no matter how small, could change the course of a life. And it could echo through generations, creating ripples of kindness that would never fade. As the evening settled in, and the stars began to twinkle above, John sat back on his porch, feeling the warmth of the moment settle in his heart. He was not just a man in the woods, he was part of something greater. Something timeless. Something that connected him to the very earth beneath his feet and the creatures who shared it with him. With Leo, Whiskers, and the young cubs by his side, John felt at peace, knowing that love and gratitude were the ties that bound them all together. Stronger than anything else in the world.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.